After the Revolutionary War, George Washington visited Charlotte and wrote in his diary that it was a, quote, trifling place. Not trifling. The city's fortunes would turn in 1799 when 12-year-old Conrad Reed found a 17-pound piece of gold on his family's land. His father John took it to be examined, and though the family was cheated out of the fair price, only getting $3.50, there was more gold to harvest on their land. The precious resource would be found in 34 total counties. Charlotte would be the country's main source of gold until 1848. Around these gold mines, shacks and tent towns bloomed as people, many recent immigrants, flooded into the area. But enslaved people were the most coveted workers. And an 1809 law in Mecklenburg County authorized armed militia patrols of enslaved people. The Reed family became wealthy, especially thanks to 18 enslaved people who helped find their gold. Like other states, the Tar Heel state would do its best to prioritize a paternalistic view of slavery as intrinsically good and valuable to not just the slaveholder and the enslaved, but to the culture of North Carolina itself. While Charlotte's leadership, composed of opposing Whigs and Democrats, hated each other, they agreed on one thing in the antebellum era: the need for a railroad. And the railroad was completed in October 1852, drawing thousands out to celebrate with music and barbecue. The North Carolina Railroad between Charlotte and other cities like Mooresville and Goldsboro would follow. At the time, Charlotte had 1,065 people, and 465 of them were enslaved black people. The railroad, built in part by these enslaved people, brought merchants, travelers, furniture, homes, and ultimately wealth to the city. The population doubled to over 2,000 people in the rest of the decade, as the area brewed with pro-slavery fervor. In 1859, the city stirred with anti-Lincoln and anti-Union sentiment and racism after the raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. Charlotte's small size meant that outsiders, like Northern abolitionists, were easily identified. And how pro-slavery was Charlotte? While North Carolina, the state, voted not to secede, Charlotte did vote to ratify secession and flew a secessionist flag on a Trade Street building by November 1860, when Lincoln was elected to the presidency. At the time, the surrounding county of Mecklenburg had approximately 6,800 enslaved people and a total of 17,000 residents. After the official secession, the people of Charlotte were stirred into Confederate patriotism, seduced into letting go of their luxuries and making sacrifices. When boys were shipped out from Charlotte to Raleigh, gushed one soldier, "Joy and pleasure. At every station where our train stopped, the ladies showered us with flowers and Godspeed." In total, over 42,000 North Carolinians would die in the Civil War, the most of any Confederate state. A bunch of North Carolinians also deserted the Confederacy, up to 23,000, even causing Robert E. Lee to complain. After the war ended, the refugees of other burnt-out southern towns and cities flocked to Charlotte, whose railroad was miraculously still intact, where federal troops operated out of the abandoned mint and pardoned Confederates. Zebulon Vance, the governor of the seceded North Carolina, was arrested in Statesville in 1865 and spent just 47 days in prison before getting out and becoming a lawyer. At least 20 refugees a day checked into the Freedmen's Bureau established on Moorhead Street, which was ran by a Captain John Barnett. While he complained that white people were thwarting the government in all its efforts to establish freedmen in their rights, he also chastened enslaved people who discussed the 40 acres and a mule rumor with, "The government has given you your freedom, and you must not expect anything further from it." Because cotton was in a short supply nationwide, Mecklenburg farmers focused on cotton over food. Without an enslaved population to employ, angry planters had to negotiate work contracts with formerly enslaved people and Freedmen Bureau Northerners. Because this was undesirable, they tried to recruit foreign labor, but thankfully failed. As for North Carolina's black people, they were already working for their advancement, with over a dozen freedmen's villages and black leaders gathering for a state equal rights league in Raleigh in 1865. One of the delegates was John T. Shank, a formerly enslaved man who would help establish the state Republican Party and was appointed by Governor William Woods Holden to be Charlotte's first black police officer in 1868. He got William R. Myers, an ex-Confederate, to donate land for the Biddle Memorial Institute, which would eventually become John Johnson C. Smith. Hundreds of schools, often no more than one-room shacks or converted multi-purpose spaces, were founded and maintained for thousands of black children during Reconstruction. The election of Holden to the governorship pissed off ex-Confederates and whites who called themselves the Conservative Party. Under Holden's leadership, there was a crackdown on Klan activity in Alamance and Caswell counties, sparked by the 1870 murders of black and white Republicans. Holden dispatched a militia to fight the Klan in these counties, designating their actions as insurrection. This was propagandized in North Carolina newspapers as overreach and treason. So when conservatives took back the legislature, they impeached Holden and began stamping out Republican organizers and stripping black people of power and land. In 1872, when federal troops left Charlotte and secessionist railroad baron William Johnston was mayor, there were around 4,500 people living in the Queen City. The area around Biddle Memorial was becoming known as Biddleville and was predominantly black by 1880, housing farmers, laborers, and craftsmen. Charlotte's cotton mills were established in 1881, and the area's cash crop was no longer shipped out of state, but spun locally, meaning more money and investment. More mills would follow, erecting housing and insular worlds for white workers, mostly families, shipped in from Appalachia and rural areas across the state. Within 15 years, there were 14 cotton mills spinning 958 looms at a time, constantly manned by people working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for less than $1 a day, with hella rules about what they could and couldn't do in their limited off time. Speaking of, in 1881, saloons were closed for a few months thanks to early prohibition sentiment. This bristled the nerves of older black people entangled in the political system, like John Shank, who was a co-owner of a saloon. He believed prohibition was a ploy to split the black vote, while younger black voices like William C. Smith, a resident of Biddleville, were leaning into respectability politics and a move away from party loyalty in urban politics. So there was clearly an ideological divide, something that you'll notice happens in history with the pendulum swinging back and forth into excess and opposition on various trends and ideas, changing with each generation. While Shank was formerly enslaved, Smith was the young founder of the Charlotte Messenger in 1882. His paper was made up of stories, articles, poetry, and advice from other papers, with him writing, "In presenting this little sheet to our people, it is hoped they will appreciate it as an honest effort on our part to promote the moral, intellectual, and material standing of our people." He also told black people to stop smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and pleasure riding. He was born in 1862 and barely experienced slavery, and didn't accept the corrupt culture of city politics, starkly different from Schneck, who allied himself with former pro-slavery secessionists. The matter of alcohol was put to a vote on June 6, 1886, with male voters saying no to prohibition 1,018 to 589. By the late 1880s, there were over 12,000 people in the Queen City. The increasingly cramped quarters led to clothing store owner Edward Dilworth Latta and investors starting the Charlotte Consolidated Construction Company, or the 4 Cs, in 1890 to develop real estate and an electric streetcar. He started off with these lovely horse-drawn cars, but where would they go? To one of the country's first ever planned suburbs, Dilworth, which offered long-term, low-cost mortgages for 1,630 large lots. Each cost about $350 to $500. The neighborhood also boasted Latta Park, according to Dan L. Morrill, featuring a lake for boating, a lily pad pond, a series of fountains, terrace floor gardens, and a network of meandering paths and drives. In the first 10 days, 78 lots were sold to 47 people, and numerous amenities would follow. While the city's wealthy were building their portfolios off of the back of white mountain folk and black sharecroppers, the farmers of Mecklenburg and surrounding counties were resentful, and they were going hungry. Thanks to the Panic of 1893, not only did they see the wealth flowing into the pockets of a few, but they were facing steep operation costs, low cotton prices, debt, bankruptcies, and a ban on free grazing animals. So they unsurprisingly gathered into the Farmers Alliance and threw their support behind the People's Party, which was anti-bank, anti-railroad, and corporation. They demanded lower interest rates and government-owned railroads, so of course the populists were denounced and smeared as radicals. John Shank called for an alliance between the populists and Republicans to defeat Democrats, which came to fruition with the Fusionists, though Shank died in 1894. The Fusionists took over the legislature that same year and immediately erected high taxes on railroads and limited interest rates on farms. Wealthy white Democrats were piss. Fusionists gained more power in 1896, notably with the only black representation in Congress, George Henry White, which only worsened Democrat anger, and a white supremacist smear campaign ripped through Fusionist power. George H. White would appoint black people to federal positions of power in his district, plus he introduced the first anti-lynching bill. He miraculously was re-elected in 1898. Poor whites and mill workers who had little to no education and barely made enough money to survive were bombarded with appeals from young white Democrats who depended on their labor about the supremacy of whiteness. While the black middle class was establishing itself by this point in Mecklenburg County, new propaganda attacked and stereotyped black character and morals. Black success was seen as dangerous. Rumblings in local papers about loud black people on a train and increased reports of black on white rapes led to calls for segregated accommodations and a return to white control. Keep in mind that lost cause ideology and propaganda that the South had fought for states' rights, not slavery, in defiance of a fascist and humane North, blah blah blah, had been circulating by this point. I've written an essay on that, which is linked in the sources. 1898 is significant for a couple more reasons. Nationwide, imperialist fever swept up everybody as the U.S. went after the Philippines, Cuba, and Hawaii. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company was founded that same year and led by John C. Merrick, and it became an instrumental factor in the black business economy of North Carolina, specifically Durham, employing over 800 people by 1940. Merrick was born in Durham as an enslaved person, and after gaining his freedom, became a barber. His company made it easy for black people to insure themselves and loved ones in payments of roughly 10 cents each, and it paid out $100 for a burial. The company circulated a new wealth in Black Durham among the Black Wall Street business district and provided new opportunities. Despite such innovations in organizing statewide, white people charged black Americans with unintelligence, calling us dangerous and evil. On November 7th, 1898, in Charlotte, thousands of white citizens held up signs crying out white supremacy and white government. White people in Wilmington, then the state's largest city and majority black, didn't take it well when a fusionist Republican won mayor and alderman. On November 9th, approximately 600 white men, most of them members of the terrorist organization, the Red Shirts, gathered to draft the White Declaration of Independence, claiming that their forefathers didn't include in the Constitution a requirement to allow their government to be led by an inferior race. They wrote, "The time has come for the intelligent citizens of this community, owning 95% of the property and paying taxes in proportion, to end the rule by Negroes." They listed out numerous demands, including the exile of Alexander Manly, who owned the city's black newspaper. He left, but the whites claimed to not receive a responsive agreement to submit to white rule from the city's black leadership. And on the next day, they began attacking and killing people. With approximately 300 black people killed, over 2,000 black people displaced, and millions of dollars of land and assets stolen and destroyed, it was the biggest coup d'etat in American history. Stated a reverend, the city was under military rule. No Negro was allowed to come into the city without being examined or without passing through with his boss, for whom he labored. Colored women were examined and their hats taken off, and search was made even under their clothing. They went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive, took arms they had hidden and killed them for the least expression of manhood. The various actors in this coup would become North Carolina politicians, orators, tastemakers, and shapers of future laws, customs, and ideas. Also, in case you're wondering, the Tuskegee Institute found that there were 101 reported lynchings between 1882 and 1968 in the Tar Heel state. That number doesn't include the over 100 black men executed by the state in cases built on shoddy evidence. Consider the fact that 1905's The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan and the inspiration for 1915's The Birth of a Nation, was written by quote-unquote professional racist and North Carolina native Thomas Frederick Dixon Jr. The book was dedicated to his uncle, a Klan leader who helped impeach Thomas Holden. So at the end of the 1890s, in control of the state government, Democrats immediately announced segregated train cars and anti-voting measures through poll taxes and literacy requirements. Not wanting to bar illiterate whites from voting, they added a clause that people who could prove their grandfather were registered to vote prior to January 1st, 1867 were granted suffrage. In 1900, 2 days before it was time to vote for this measure, 600 red shirts marched down Tryon Street to Latta Park in Charlotte in a show of force to keep black people away from the polls, led by police. The amendment passed and was in effect until 1908. For those years, only 2% of registered voters were black people. So at the turn of the century, there were new shops, apartments, and markets in the Queen City, while the population was approximately 18,000. But black people were even further disadvantaged than they had been in the 2 decades after slavery. It's no wonder the black population would fall from 40 to 31% by 1920. The disenfranchisement of black North Carolinians meant the Democrats were no longer afraid of splitting the white vote when it came to prohibition. While the city of Charlotte had voted against prohibition in 1886, Mecklenburg County voted in favor in 1904. The state would follow with the South's first prohibition law in 1908. So in 1940, the state had nearly 3.6 million inhabitants, and nearly 1 million of them were black. Around this time, only 625 black people were registered to vote in Charlotte, compared to 10,000 whites. Most worked in farming and agriculture, though there were 26 practicing lawyers, 53 mail carriers, and hundreds of teachers. According to the census, the black population was being overworked, showing 52.6% of the Negroes who were working at that time worked over 40 hours a week, and 34.2% worked over 48 hours a week. Additionally, 75% of the black population were renters and did not own the property they lived on or worked on. As for recreation, there were just 5 swimming pools and/or parks for black people in 1943, only in High Point, Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, and Winston-Salem. Charlotte added Pearl Street Park, the first and only black recreation facility, that same year. 20 counties had 22 public libraries for black people, and those in other counties were served by traveling libraries. The amount of black people who worked in agriculture would be slashed in the 40s because of the New Deal. While Democrats fought against reforms, they accepted $440 million from the federal government, and per directions grew less tobacco to drive up the price. Landowners won, and many sharecroppers lost their jobs. Black people got meager relief offered by New Deal federal assistance programs, but the loss of jobs was devastating. Also, let's not forget, from 1933 onward, the state sterilized 5,000 black women with coercion and trickery out of at least 7,686 total people. Charlotte's racism would be exposed to a greater audience, as in a national audience, in 1957 when 15-year-old Dorothy Counts was enrolled at Harding University High School, one of 4 students chosen to integrate the city schools under the Pearsall Plan. The plan was North Carolina's attempt to gradually integrate schools rather than doing it all at once or straight up doing massive resistance like Virginia. As Dorothy walked regally and calmly into school that day in 1957, people threw bricks at her, white women spat on her, and people yelled epithets. She fell ill the very next day, probably because those filthy bastards were spitting on her, and she only spent 4 days in class total, saying, "My father called the superintendent. He called the police department, and they said, 'We cannot guarantee your safety.' And my dad said, 'It's not worth it.'" The incident, which was widely circulated around the world, was one of the catalyst events that led to self-exiled James Baldwin returning to America. In 1960, Charlotte City Council voted in favor of a new urban renewal project in Brooklyn, and it gave paltry sums to black landowners to leave, and then it razed what was left of the historic black neighborhood, demolishing 24 blocks that displaced 1,000 families and 200 businesses. Wow. The area was then filled with office space, government buildings, roads, and a park. In April, the city rolled out a new project to connect 2 expressways into the Brookshire Freeway, slicing through more black neighborhoods on the west side, including Biddleville. That same year, Harris Teeter was founded in Charlotte. 2 years later, Price's Chicken Coop was open, starting a love affair for boxed, deep-fried chicken and fixings whose COVID-era closing would sadden communities of all colors. The white-owned restaurant had been one of the few integrated restaurants in the city in the mid-20th century. Speaking of food and lunch, in 1960, while the Greensboro sit-ins are more well-known, several sit-ins occurred around Charlotte, notably at Woolworth's and Ivy's department store lunch counter, done predominantly by Johnson C. Smith students. In spring of 1963, protesters walked from Johnson C. Smith to downtown, with Dr. Reginald Hawkins telling the city that more protests would follow. The Chamber of Commerce and mayor insisted behind the scenes that restaurants and hotels integrate to avoid bad publicity, and another protest. Black and white leaders of the city began eating with each other on May 29, 1963, in a mass-coordinated eat-in. The message? Business and capital over outright racism. In 1965, Charlotte's first black member of the city council, Frederick Douglass Alexander, was elected. Meanwhile, schools largely remained unintegrated in the 60s. Only 822 black students were integrated out of 20,000 from 1964 to 1965. Lawyer Julius L. Chambers took on a total 55 school desegregation and public accommodations discrimination lawsuits in 1965. His home and offices, plus those of Kelly Alexander, Frederick Alexander, and Reginald Hawkins, were bombed. He continued working though, taking on a famous case for Darius and Vera Swan. Darius was a Johnson C. Smith professor whose son was being kept out of an elite school in Charlotte. So white parents formed the Concerned Parents Association and sent a petition with 67,000 signatures to Nixon as private schools were built for all of the white children. Chambers argued that the city was failing in desegregating schools and that black students at integrated schools had better scores and performance than ones at all black schools. Regardless of how Charlotte parents felt about it, the city schools were ordered to integrate busing by James B. McMillan in 1970, which would be upheld by the Supreme Court in Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education in 1971. In those first 2 years, there were numerous violent incidents between students, and a chunk of white parents pulled their kids out. For instance, in 1970, Providence Day School was one of the many segregation academies founded in Charlotte in the wake of the busing.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
The Excelsior sway would not help Harvey Gantt in his 1990 pursuit of North Carolina state senator against the vile racist and homophobe Jesse Helms, Billy Graham's bestie. Helms ran a smear campaign based on the conservative state's worst fears. Described the Times, the new Helms commercials accused Mr. Gantt of running a secret campaign in homosexual communities and of being committed to mandatory gay rights laws, including requiring local schools to hire gay teachers. Gantt was also accused of running a secret campaign just for black voters. I love this picture of a white woman shoving a Harvey Gantt poster in Helms' face, by the way. It was the closest Helms ever came to getting voted out of office. Banking was a huge business in Charlotte, and it was the nation's second largest bank capital after New York, thanks to the nation's bank corporate center merger that became Bank of America. Additionally, because Clinton greenlit interstate banking in 1994, the entire system grew. The same year of the Loomis robbery, bank executive Joe Martin advocated for Race Day, or having lunch with someone of a different race every Thursday, saying that the city needed to be more interested in breaking down racial barriers. He notedly ate with different black community leaders at McDonald's cafeteria. McDonald's cafeteria was founded by John McDonald, offering up fried chicken, fried fish, mac and cheese, whipped rutabagas, pecan pie, and other soul food on Beatties Ford. McDonald was one of 15 children and a native of Charlotte. His restaurant grew so popular that it moved to a new location in the same neighborhood in 1981, and eventually boasted 3 dining rooms and multiple meeting rooms, as well as a hotel and mini golf. By the way, that $3 million 5-story, 106-room hotel was the first in the Beatties Ford area. McDonald's cafeteria would become an iconic institution, serving over 2,000 people a day in 1992, making it one of the most popular non-chain restaurants in the city. The family sold the restaurant in 1997 and it would be closed 6 years later, unfortunately. In fall 1999, I began kindergarten at Barringer Academic Center, then named for white supremacist Osmond Barringer and built on top of a former gold mine. In 2021, it was thankfully renamed for Charles H. Parker, a former enslaved man who went on to be a community leader and developer of the West Boulevard community. An investigation by Dr. Willie Griffin found over 30 streets, schools, and other locations around Charlotte named after Confederates and white supremacists.